Well, good morning, each one. It is a beautiful, crisp morning here in beautiful West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you all out today to hear this message. And I would like you to think about something with me this morning. If I were to ask you, what is the first thing that you think about when you hear the name Peter, I wonder what you would think of. A common illustration would be if I asked you, what do you think about Hitler? Obvious things would come to mind. What do you think about famous, Wayne Gretzky? What do you think? The first thing that comes to your mind when you think about these people is what they were predominantly known for. And I'd like you to think about something. What is it that Peter is known for or first comes to your mind when you think about his name? Well, you may think about the fact that he was the one that told Jesus, even if all these other disciples fail you, Lord, I'll make sure that I don't fail you. That might be one thing you're thinking. You may be thinking about the fact that he walked on water once and then had to cry out for Jesus when he was sinking. You may be thinking about how that he cut off that servant of the high priest, cut off his ear. Different things might come to mind, but I can almost guarantee you the first thing you think about when you hear the name Peter is not humility. However, we can tell when we read Peter's first epistle, the 5th chapter, we can tell when we read that Peter must have experienced a radical change in his life. He went from not having humility to somebody, an apostle, who was writing a letter telling the entire group that he's writing to that they needed to practice humility. That means there had to have been a radical paradigm shift in Peter's mind. And I'm wondering, what is it that happened in Peter's life? When I look at that, by way of introduction, I think Peter was finally brought to a place of humility when he realized for the first time in his life how greatly he had failed the Lord. I believe that after him telling Jesus that yes, all these other disciples might fail you, but I never will, and his boastful arrogance, I believe that when Peter finally turned and ran from Jesus like the rest of the disciples did, and then he had time to reflect on his actions, I believe it's at that point where humility started becoming real or genuine in his life. We know there had to have been a radical change in his life because when he writes his first epistle or first letter, he talks about humility in that last section, chapter 5. And he devotes quite a few verses talking to the people he was writing to about humility. And that's what I'd actually like to speak about today. Now, this sermon will probably end up being a 2-part series. I'm trying to keep the lessons down to around 10 to 15 minutes. So probably this will be a 2-part series. But I would like to begin by reading 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning at verse number 5. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he might exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. So I'd like you to notice the very first section here. Notice what he does. He speaks about mutual submission. Now, mutual submission, that's me submitting to you and you submitting to me. And as a pastor, I can't help but think about how this concept of humility applies to the local church. And now, it doesn't matter what church you're in. This applies to all people working for Jesus Christ. I'd like you to think about this. If everybody submitted to one another, what would the chances be of church fighting? Well, if I'm submitting to you and you're submitting to me, it's actually impossible to have a fight. And if I'm submitting to you, you're submitting to me, what that means in a positive way, not only are we not fighting, it means that we can work together for the kingdom of God. We can work for what really matters. But look what Peter said. It says submit one to another. That word submission means to place yourself under somebody else. And it doesn't mean that you have to shut your brain off. It doesn't mean that you no longer think about situations. It doesn't mean that you don't have your own opinions. But what it does mean, it means that you practice loving, willing submission with one another. And if we as churches would do that with one another, the chances of having church problems statistically would be put down somewhere close to zero. Very important point. Peter learned this the hard way. He learned because he had failed greatly in his life. And I know my own life. Some of the greatest spiritual lessons that I have learned have come after I have greatly failed in some area. And that is when my ears are open and God is speaking to me more clearly, because I'm in a position where my pride is gone. I've already failed. And I no longer am depending on myself. Instead, I am willing to listen to God because he has taught me through my failure. And 1 Peter chapter 5, verse number 5, we can see where Peter has obviously learned from his failure. If Peter had written this letter before the crucifixion, if he had written this letter that early, he would be saying, okay, all of you, you listen to me. Okay, all of you, you submit to me. But Peter, now that he's failed, he has been put in a place where now he's ready to listen to God. I would encourage each one, don't know who's listening to this once again, but I would encourage each one just to examine your own life and ask yourself this question. Am I really submitting to others? And what does it look like? Look what he does here in verse 5, submission. All of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. So how does this humility work out? What does it look like? When he says be clothed with humility, that is an interesting word or term in the original. It was used of a slave putting on his apron and getting ready to go to work. When he put that apron on, it was outwardly visible to everybody looking at him that he was a slave and that he was working for somebody else. In other words, he was submissive to his master's desires, and he was going and doing their work. We know what Peter says for Christians? Peter says, Christians, look, don't be the boss. Don't be the one running things. I want you to submit to one another. And how do you do it? He said, be clothed with humility. Put on that slave's apron or that servant's apron and be willing to serve one another. I'm thinking about what Jesus did in John chapter 13 at the Last Supper. John 13 mentions that Jesus took off his outer robe and then he wrapped himself with a towel and he went around and he washed the disciples' feet. Now, interestingly enough, who was it that said, you will never wash my feet? Everybody? Who was that? It was Peter. Peter said, no, Jesus, don't wash my feet. You can't do this. And here was Peter recognizing that Jesus was taking on the form of a slave or a servant. And Peter knew his own heart. Peter knew that he would never be willing to go and wash John's feet, because that was the job of a slave. Or he would never go and wash anybody else's feet. But here's Jesus coming and washing his feet. And at the end of this story, Peter is beginning to learn something about himself. And it's only a few hours later when he betrays Christ, denies that he ever knew him, and ends up weeping after the rooster crows. And that's a good lesson for us. Peter was brought to an end of himself. And folks, what God does in his love and his mercy through discipline, he often will bring us to an end of ourselves where there's no way to look except up. And Peter was brought to that point. And now what he does, after Peter has been brought to that point and sees the spiritual beauty of humility, he's writing other people saying, look, you guys, all of you, serve one another. That's what it's all about. So it's Christian Day, let's practice that. And I do want you to notice something. When he said, be submissive to one another, be clothed with humility, that actually is an imperative. It's a command. It's not a suggestion. You've jokingly heard how the 10 Commandments have sometimes been turned into the 10 suggestions, or the 10 Commandments have been turned into the 10 questions. Well, this here, be clothed with humility, and be humble, submit yourself to one. This is actually a command. It's not just a declaration. So Peter is saying, all of you Christians, you submit yourselves to one another. Now, he does tell us, I want you to notice a key point in verse number 5, the last part of it. He tells us why we should submit to one another. It's for our own good. Look what it says. God, this is why you should do it. Because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So it's for our own good. He uses two statements to teach it. First of all, a negative one and a positive one. There's a negative reason for being humble, and there's a positive reason given. The negative reason is this: God resists the proud. That word resist means to stand against an opponent. Picture it this way. If you have a football team and Team A has all their great big tackle guys up front, all the 300 plus pound guys, and then Team B has all their 300 plus pound guys standing, and they're ready to stand against each other. So what happens in football, in a minor way, happens in the spiritual realm in a much greater way. Just like in football, those two teams oppose each other or they resist each other. Here we have in the spiritual kingdom, if you are proud, you're arrogant, you refuse to admit you're wrong, you won't accept advice from other people, it has to be your way. If that's true of you, the Bible says here, God resists that person. Now, it's one thing for a human to resist me. It's another thing for me to resist a human. That's on a much smaller level. But here in this passage, it's not another human resisting you if you're proud. It is God himself who stands against you. So the first reason given why we should be humble is because if we're not, God himself will be our opponent and stand against us. And in the earthly realm, maybe Team A will win 2 to 3 matches and Team B will win this many matches and so on. But do you know God has 100% success rate? God always wins. Every opponent God takes on, God always wins. And I'd like you to notice something else. Notice here, when you look at this verse, God shows his attitude towards these two kinds of people. First of all, he resists you if you're proud, but look at this. He gives grace to the humble. So if you want to be found in favor today with God, you want him to smile upon you and your life, one of the first things you need to do is be humble, because God gives grace to the humble. God does not give grace to the proud. He gives grace to the humble. And that's something that all of us need, is God to smile upon us. Now, I'd like to make an observation here at this point. Notice verse number 6. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he might exalt you in due time. Now, I want you to notice, God is not indifferent to humility and pride. God's not indifferent to that. To the proud, God stands against them. To the humble, God gives grace. So he's not indifferent. God does respond in one way or another depending on what you're like. So my big encouragement for you today is to get alone with God and say, God, okay, I want you to show me in my life, do I have pride in any area? Do I have pride in my marriage? Do I have pride in my church? Is there something? Do I have pride in the abilities that you have given me? Remember, in one sense, none of us really have anything to be proud over. All we can be proud over, if you want to boast about something, Jeremiah chapter 9 says, if you want to boast about something, just boast about the fact that you have a relationship with God. And that's quoted again in the New Testament. So the only thing that we have to boast about is God's goodness to us. It's all about Him and not about us. So I would encourage you today. I'm going to finish the next part next week. But I'd like you to think about verse number 6. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. He says it again. Why does He do that? So that He might exalt you in due time. And I'd like you to notice in your time, in preparation for the next devotion, God willing, if He gives us another week where we do this, I would like you to look at verse number 7. It shows you how that you can show your humility. Casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Verse number 7, casting all your care on Him, is closely related in the original language to verse number 6. And I trust that this week, from this moment on, if you already don't have it, from this moment on, I would ask each of you, listening to this, to say, God, search my heart. And God, if I've got any pride in my life that should not be there in any area, please, Lord, reveal it to me. And I will get rid of it, but with your help and with your strength. God bless you, and I trust that this message touches your heart today.